Pet Sematary 2019. Note: this spoiler was submitted by Jeremy. The film starts with an overhead shot of a house on fire. We move to the house next door, which has a trail of muddy footprints leading up to the door, which has been stained with blood. Dr. Lewis Creed, Jason Clark, is driving his wife Rachel, Amy Seimetz, kids Ellie, Jeet Lawrence, Anne Gage, Hugo and Lucas Lavoie, and Ellie's cat Church, from Boston to their new home in Ludlow, Maine. Ellie admires the new home and goes around to explore. While Lewis goes to work at the university hospital, Ellie and Rachel spot a group of children with creepy animal masks orchestrating a procession for the deceased dog of one of the kids. Ellie wanders away from the house and comes across the pet cemetery, misspelled cemetery. As she tries to climb a pile of logs, she is stopped by the Creed's new neighbor, Judd Crandall, John Lithgow. Ellie falls and gets stung by a bee. Judd helps pull the stinger out and rub dirt on it before Rachel comes looking for Ellie. After meeting Judd, he warns Rachel that the area can be a bit unsafe for kids. Later that night, Lewis has a talk with Ellie about death and the afterlife. He later talks to Rachel about it and affirms his belief that there is nothing after death. At the hospital, a young man named Victor Pascoe, Obsav Ahmed, is brought in after a hit and run. His face is horribly mutilated with his brain exposed, terrifying the nurses. Lewis does his best to revive Pascoe, but he dies. Moments later, Pascoe appears to revive before Lewis and tell him something about a barrier that must not be broken. A nurse comes in, and Lewis thinks he was just hallucinating, but he is still shaken for failing to save the man. The next day, Ellie goes to bring a basket of cookies to Judd. She walks into his house and is found by him. She sees a picture of his late wife Norma, Susie Stinkle, and asks about her. Judd later has dinner with the Creeds as Ellie shows off her ballet skills. Later, Lewis has a vision that Pascoe is calling out to him. Lewis walks through a door and ends up in the woods. Pascoe tells Lewis he is trying to help him and then aggressively warns that the ground is sour. Lewis is woken up by Gage, leading him to think that he was just having a crazy dream until he sees under his sheets to find that his feet are covered in dirt. On Halloween, Judd calls Lewis to come see something. They find Church dead after being hit by a truck. They hide this from Ellie to spare her the heartbreak. Lewis tells Rachel, who tells him that she feels she has been haunted since moving in. Since she was a child, Rachel has been traumatized by the death of her sister Zelda, Alyssa Brooke Levine, who suffered from spinal meningitis and would taunt Rachel about her ending up the same way. One night, the girl's parents were out, and Rachel had to feed Zelda using the dumbwaiter to raise her food up to her room, even though Rachel was warned not to do so since it gets stuck. Sure enough, it did just that, and when Zelda tried to get her food, she fell down the shaft, and Rachel saw her sister's mangled body. It has left her feeling guilty ever since, and she doesn't want Ellie to go through a similar feeling. Lewis goes with Judd to bury Church in the pet cemetery, but Judd offers to help Lewis so that Ellie won't feel sad for her loss. They climb the log pile that Ellie tried to climb and walk further to a burial ground where they place Church. The following morning, Lewis and Rachel try to tell Ellie that Church ran away, but she tells him that he came back last night and is in the closet. To Lewis's surprise, she is correct, although Church is clearly not the same. Lewis looks into the history of the grounds while Ellie tries to play with Church. She tries brushing his fur, but notices that it is knotted up and that he smells bad. Church then scratches Ellie before running off. Later, while Lewis and Rachel try to get intimate, Church brings a dead bird to the bed and starts gnawing at its stomach. Lewis later finds a drawing that Ellie says was made by Gage, which is of a man being hit by a car and lying in a pool of blood, much like Pascoe. He then goes to talk to Judd about Church returning. Judd tells him that the grounds are said to contain an entity known as the Wendigo that can bring things back from the dead, but they won't come back the same. Lewis then returns home to find Church in Gage's crib after attacking and frightening the poor boy. Lewis attempts to euthanize Church, but can't bring himself to do so when the cat momentarily appears to be his normal sweet self. He instead brings Church by the highway and leaves him so that he can just tell Ellie that he ran away. The family throws a party for Ellie's 9th birthday, but she is still missing Church. As the kids start playing, Ellie wanders off when she sees Church in the street. She walks up to him in the middle of the road, and Gage walks over to follow. Lewis notices Gage in the street and runs to save him just as a truck heads their way. However, the truck driver swerves to avoid them, but the tanker he is carrying falls off and strikes Ellie, killing her. Rachel breaks down while Lewis runs to his daughter's body in utter devastation. Ellie is laid to rest, and Rachel is so overcome with grief that she takes Gage with her to stay at her parents' house. Judd later joins Lewis outside by a campfire to grieve with him. Judd feels that he is to blame for Ellie's death, as he should have never shown Lewis the burial grounds, feeling that there is a power to it that affects those who go near it. Judd knows what Lewis is thinking of doing, but before he can try and convince him to do otherwise, he drugs Judd's drink and waits until he passes out before heading out. Lewis goes to the cemetery and digs up Ellie's body, then goes to bury her beyond the pet cemetery. Mere hours later, Ellie returns alive, mostly, to her house, and Lewis embraces her. However, she now speaks with a monotone, her eye is disfigured from the accident, and she is able to remember the moments leading up to her death. Lewis sleeps next to her, now slightly more unsettled. At Rachel's parents' house, she is continuously haunted by Zelda, seeing her twisted body crawling toward her, and even having Rachel take her form. Meanwhile, Gage yells out Pasco's name, apparently seeing him in visions as well. Rachel tries to get in touch with Lewis, who manages to avoid telling her what he did. She ends up deciding to take an early trip back home, after contacting Judd to say she hasn't been able to reach Lewis. At the same time, Ellie starts to grow increasingly disturbing as she dances around the living room, but begins to smash things in a rage. Judd goes to the Creed house to talk to Lewis, where he lies about not hearing from Rachel, and he starts to look more and more insane. Judd knows what he did and tells him what he has to do now, which Ellie overhears. Judd goes back home to get his gun when he hears something moving in the house. Ellie sneaks up on him and severs his Achilles tendon. Now crippled, Judd tries to go for his gun, while Ellie taunts him and says he let Norma die. To drive the knife further, she takes Norma's appearance to torment Judd. Ellie then proceeds to stab him to death. Rachel and Gage return home. Just as Rachel goes to embrace Lewis, Ellie walks in and horrifies her mother. Knowing that this is not her daughter, she runs upstairs with Gage. Lewis goes over to Judd's house for help, but finds him dead. He runs back as Rachel is lowering Gage out the window to Lewis as Ellie tries to break in. She does so and stabs Rachel in the abdomen. Rachel tells Ellie that her real daughter is dead, and Ellie delivers the fatal stab. She then drags Rachel's body away. Lewis locks Gage in the car and goes to find Ellie. They find each other in the woods, and Lewis realizes he has to kill Ellie. He tries to strangle her and then kills her with a shovel, but he hesitates when she acts like her old self again. Before he can do it, Lewis is impaled through the chest by a resurrected Rachel. She and Ellie then drag Lewis to the pet cemetery. It is now morning. The undead Creeds have burned down Judd's house. They walk up to the car, with Gage still inside, and Church shows up to leap onto the car. Lewis walks up to his son, and Gage, none the wiser, unlocks the car. The Creed family, Lewis, Rachel, Ellie, Gage, and Cat Church, move from Boston to Ludlow, Maine. They befriend their neighbor Judd Crandall. After Church is killed by a truck, Judd brings Lewis to the town's pet cemetery to spare Ellie the pain of losing him, which is inhabited by a spirit that can resurrect the dead, but bringing them back in a more sinister form. They bury Church there, and he returns more vicious. Lewis tries to kill him, but can't do it, so he abandons him down the road. On Ellie's 9th birthday, she walks into the street when she sees Church and is killed when a truck swerves and its tanker strikes her. Overcome with grief, Rachel leaves with Gage to her parents' home, while Lewis digs up Ellie's body and buries her in the pet cemetery. She returns and is no longer the sweet girl she was in life, but a more grim and disturbed being. After finding out what Lewis did, Judd tries to kill Ellie before she does something terrible, but she gets to him first and kills him. Rachel and Gage return home to find the resurrected Ellie, who proceeds to attack her family. Lewis brings Gage to safety, but Ellie kills Rachel and takes her body to the pet cemetery. Before Lewis can kill Ellie, Rachel returns and kills him first. They bring him back, and it is implied Gage will suffer the same fate.